Let's move on to our next speaker, and that will be Sara Salman. And Sara Salman is an officer at the UN Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia. She is a governance professional with particular expertise in parliamentary development and democratic governance in the Arab region. Dr. Salman has also worked with a number of international organizations, including the World Bank and the United Nations Development Programme. During a career spanning more than a decade, she has fostered an extensive network of leading experts. Sarah, for you, I would just say, if I know that you in the ESQA and that you all are also preparing for the regional review, and I'm wondering how you go about collecting data and analyzing the data on migration, because you have so many complexities around migration in the region, in the Middle Eastern region. You have you have among the highest population of refugees. You have a big population of migrants. You have displaced populations, and how is all this collected, put together? I know that you're in the office as well at the moment. There is some kind of collection of this data and preparation for the ESQA meeting. But if you could share with us some of the complexities in the Arab region that you are currently dealing with in this collection and analysis of data. Sarah, over to you.
Thank you, William. I hope you all hear me well. It is difficult to come actually and speak after all the excellent speakers that have come before me. They have covered a wide range of issues and some that are pretty relevant actually to our region. Before I answer your question, perhaps, William, if you allow me just maybe a few comments. The first thing that came to mind when I was invited to speak in today's panel, which I think is extremely timely, especially with the regional reviews and the national reviews coming up for the GCM. The first thought that came to me, it's that it's not by chance that the first objective of the GCM is on data. And that's something that Bella had alluded to. It is having this disaggregated and timely and accessible data is a precondition, really, for achieving all the remaining 22 objectives of the GCM. And I think once we have that in the background of our mind, once we know that without that data, we will not be able to have the 360-degree vision, accurate vision of migration and how to better manage it. Data does not become just numbers and something that is dry, as you had mentioned, William. It becomes about the people, about the person behind the number. And therefore, and I think the current pandemic, the times that we live in today, have humanized a little bit more the migration data. Working with countries that are trying to respond to the COVID situation from a migration lens, the first thing that they ask for, okay, who are our migrants? Who are the most vulnerable among our migrants? Whether the migrants, international migrants in our own countries or our own migrants abroad, who are the ones that need to be targeted with social assistance packages if there is a capacity for that? Which migrants have underlying health conditions and therefore need, special treatment? I don't know which migrant children are affected by the school shutdown. So really, the data doesn't become just the science, the statistical science that we all, or not all, some of us fear, myself included. It becomes the story of the humans. And the people that need our protection the most. And I think once we wear that lens and we start seeing migration data from that lens, it changes our perhaps perception of how to go about this data. That being said, knowing this data doesn't only allow us to empower or protect the migrants, it also protects migrants from the negative stereotypes and the discourse and the xenophobia. And for example, what we saw in the times of COVID, migrants being carriers of disease as hotspots for the outbreak of the pandemic, etc., while having more data on the level of skills that they bring, the type of jobs that they carry, etc., will allow us to paint a proper and accurate picture that showcases both perhaps the challenges with the migration, but also their contribution in their respective societies, both their home and in their destination communities. So these are some of the things that come to mind. And again, with maybe drawing on some of my experience with working the governments, and here I will talk about data from the government perspective before I say about what we are doing at the UN, at UNESCO. Some of the challenges we face when we work with governments is that the migration data, yes, it's scarce, yes, it's not disaggregated, it's also not centralized. So it's not only the national statistical offices. We find that the Ministry of Health has its own set of data. The Ministry of Education has its data. Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Interior, Ministry of Labor. And not all ministries centralize their data. They don't make it accessible. They don't even share it among the ministries of the same government. And if there's the intention to share it, since it's not comparable, it makes it almost useless for analysis purposes. So here the idea of how data is collected at the level of the government, I'm saying, has its own sets of challenges that is good for the participants that represent multiple stakeholders from many regions that are with you today. It's good to have that kind of thought in the background as we think about moving forward with the data. What do we want? What do we want to help our government do? So that's one question. The other question that comes to my mind is, what challenges does more data pose? And here it's not just about being overwhelmed with the amount of data that perhaps you can get, especially that it spans all the different sectors, as Sonia had mentioned. We need to prioritize. Yes, we do. But the other challenge here, and it has to do with privacy and how data could be used perhaps against the migrants themselves. And in that sense, migrants that are in an irregular status, for example, migrants with certain types of illnesses or diseases such as STDs, for example, that in certain countries could be used against them. So how do we collect the data that is needed to allow for evidence-based policies and at the same time ensure the privacy, the dignity, and the well-being of the migrants? I think is a question that is perhaps not for this discussion, but is a question that is worth pondering upon when we think about migration data, with all the sensitivities that are out there. And the third is, what kind of data do we need? It's not, again, the data as in the GCM, data disaggregated by age, sex, migratory status, among others, is needed. But with the more, with this pandemic and in other situations, the more we think about it, we realize, given the multi-sectoral nature of migration, there's the need for the multi-sectoral type of data that allows for evidence-based policies across those different sectors, whether it's from, I don't know, urban planning, whether it's from border management, whether it's from health and education and accesses to other services and what have you. So I think looking at data from a migration perspective and from the broad span of issues that migration covers, makes maybe the job a little bit more daunting and a little bit more difficult in that sense, but I think is an exercise that is worth thinking about. And here, if I want to maybe mention a little bit about what Bella said, is that it's good that we don't have actually an indicator framework for GCM, and that we tie migration to the 2030 agenda to look at it from the holistic perspective of development that the 2030 agenda offers. That is true. However, when the governments are reporting on their they're preparing their VNRs, their voluntary national reviews, in preparation for the HLPF, for their national reviews, what have you, for the regional reviews, when an indicator or when the goal itself doesn't have a clear set of targets and indicators that are relevant to migration, which is in many of the goals, the countries don't have the incentive to include migration or to mainstream migration if that there are. Although the environment, the economy, what have you, they're all relevant to migration in one way or another. So if we do not provide an incentive for countries and for other stakeholders that prepare perhaps shadow reports for the VNRs, if we don't tell them there is an incentive for you to integrate or to mainstream migration in your VNRs, the VNRs that have been submitted so far have been, at least in our region, have not been big on reporting on migration, although migration in our region in particular is heavily linked to development, having both sending, transit, and receiving countries in one region. So I think maybe here, as different stakeholders, as the UN, as other partners, we need to rethink how do we encourage Or how do we incentivize this mainstreaming of migration further into the VNR process? Do we add additional indicators? Is it something that is done informally with the governments, with the stakeholders, without changing really the sets of indicators that are out there, and then adapting the existing indicators to include migrants? I think this is a discussion that 2 years after the adoption of the GCM is now, I think, is a prime time. And here I will come to the question you had asked me about the regional review. In our region, William, in our region, we are working on the regional review for the GCM. We are doing it in 2020, along with IOM and the League of the Arab States, and around 18 UN agencies that are contributing to this process. And in order to do that, we have developed a guiding template that includes a set of questions in line with the template that was developed by the Global Network on Migration. And we had shared this template with our member states and asked them to basically develop their national reports, and ask them to submit their national reports so that we can synthesize the national reports in order to come out with a regional comparative report. As you would have probably seen in the template that was developed by the Global Network, not many of the questions are about the situation, the socioeconomic situation of migrants. It's more about what have the governments done in terms of the policies adopted or the measures taken or how they coordinated the regional review, what have you. And so I think that in this round of the region review, and this is my current perception, this of course might change after we see the input from the countries. We haven't received them yet. We're expecting to receive them in the next month. So having not seen those reports, I would assume that we will not get that much information when it comes to an accurate description of the socioeconomic situation of migrants in those countries, because that's not what the question is. Or most of the questions did not really focus on that. I think this will be a question for us to think collectively about as we prepare for the next round of the GCM review. This year is the first GCM review, is definitely going to be a very steep learning curve for the different stakeholders involved, for the UN agencies, for the member countries, for the civil society and other stakeholders. One of the things that we might want to think about is how do we address or how do we capture better the idea of data for, and the ability of countries to develop those evidence-based and responsive policies. Because when we say an evidence-based policy, what we really mean, it's a responsive policy, because who are you targeting with this policy, how many people, what is their description, does it meet their needs or not? That's really when we say evidence-based, it means responsive. So this is something that I wanted to share from our region in response to your question. The other thing that we do at UNESCO is, for those of you who have seen it, we prepare the situation report on international migration in the Arab region. And in that report, we basically use UNDESA data, and we use data from other sources, including the World Bank, including UNHCR on refugees, given the issue of refugees in our region. So we use existing, we do not collect new data. We use existing data on migrants and refugees in the region in order to provide a regionalized analysis to give the picture of patterns and trends and drivers of migration in the Arab region. That's the first chapter of the report. The second chapter of the report, and here again, when we think of data, we usually think of quantitative data. However, qualitative data is equally important. And so in the second chapter of our report, what we do is we try to build a compendium of policies that have been adopted over the reporting period, which is usually a 2-year period, to kind of measure how are countries progressing in formulations of policies on migration, what kind of areas do they gain most attention, without going into the exercise of evaluating those policies per se. That is not something that we do. We just provide the information of what policies are out there, and that itself, and currently, so the 2019 report came out actually a few months ago, earlier in the spring. but we are currently preparing for the 2021 report, and collecting the policies that are out there in the region formulated by the countries on migration is a huge task, because again, given the multi-sectoral nature of migration, the policies from the different ministries are all relevant. Not all policies are published. So how do we get access to that type of information? I think should also be a question when we think about migration data, that we go beyond the number, and think what type of data is it that we actually need. So this is maybe another reflection that I have. And the last thing I wanted to perhaps mention is the in objective 1K, which highlights basically the need for cooperation with relevant stakeholders to develop research, studies, and surveys. I think I will conclude with this so I don't take more of the time. Um, it's a good question. So when we think of data, we usually think of the big players. We think of the national statistical offices, the government bodies, some of the UN agencies, but we don't trickle down the data effect in that sense, because at the local, if you start from the smallest unit, from let's say the local level of a municipality, perhaps could have more relevant and more direct data than data provided at a much macro level. So how do we create the linkages between the different sources of data in order to have that not necessarily universal or comparable methodology, but at least some guiding frameworks, guiding principles on how to collect the data on migrants, in order to enhance perhaps that cooperation that is mentioned in the GCM, without really the objective itself doesn't really elaborate on how could this be done. It just says, okay, we need more cooperation. But maybe this is a good place to start from, especially in this forum today, with given the diverse backgrounds of the participants on this webinar. How do we encourage this cooperation? What does it entail? Who are the relevant partners here? Do we need to have some guiding frameworks for such collaboration and cooperation? I think these are all questions that could benefit from our collective thinking. These are some of the comments I wanted to make. If you have any more questions, William, or anyone from the audience, I'm happy to answer. I'm also going to share in the chat box the link to the 2019 situation report for your reference, as you see needed and fit. Over to you.
Thank you, Sarah, for that intervention. And actually, you've put us in a tough place, in a sense of your very first statement said that it is the first objective, upon which realizing the first objective means realizing all the other 22 objectives. You put data right on top as the most important objective. And to some extent, I agree with you, but I'm looking at the chat box and I'm looking at all the challenges that people are putting with regard to data. And you yourself have said, and you know for yours as well, that in the region that you are working in, and the UN is Esquire is collecting this data, and you'll bring out your international the report as well. You work in a region in which data is very hard to come by. Governments refuse to and are very reluctant in giving the kind of data we are looking for. So I think it would be very important for us to, while I agree with you, to see the look at the chat box and the comments that have been coming up to say how difficult this is. And it might be good for us to recognize this. While it is an important instrument that can be used, it is often very it actually is not being utilized in the way it should. And you also hinted at of how it is sometimes used to the detriment of migrant workers in the case of undocumented migrants, or migrants stranded migrants, and situations of security and privacy and things like that with regard to migrants in terms of data and collection of that data. So it might be important for us to therefore come back to that question then, which is being put in the chat box. A question that is being framed there, I can see, is how relevant and the GCM objective, is this going to be a turning point in the way we gather data and present data and use data in migration governance? And I